Recently, I've been seeing a bit of a trend in my YouTube comments. If you go onto some of my more poppin' videos and you scroll down, you will see a remarkable number of people comment things like, I have a great GPA, Pratik, I have some really good extracurriculars, my whole application is good. But my SAT score is at a 1400. It's at a 1450. But I'm interested in applying to Ivy League and BSMD programs. Do you think I can get in? Now here's the thing, answering that question is a whole debate in itself. But the thing that keeps going off in my mind when I read these comments is, how has this happened? In my opinion, I think the SAT is one of the most controllable parts of your application, and honestly, with the right guidance, it's one of the easiest things that you can do to push to the limits, check off on your application, and use it as one of the strong focal points. It should not be something that's holding you back. And so with all these comments coming in, I want to put it a little bit on the forefront of my channel to give you guys all the SAT guidance that you need to go out there and get your 1550 level scores, because this is something that with the right tips, you can absolutely do. Let's rewind things to the start here. What's your goal with this SAT score? Well, if you're aiming for those top institutions, the absolute minimum score that you really need to be competitive in today's day and age is at least a 1500. But we are aiming for the tip of the iceberg. So we want to try to shoot for around a 1530 to a 1550 at least as our baseline score. Anything above that is a bonus. If this is your first video introduction to the SAT and the SAT prep, welcome. I don't mean to overwhelm you by putting all these crazy numbers in your head and setting expectations, but if you're familiar with my channel, you know that I'm trying to keep it as real as possible. And so don't feel bad about where you're starting right now. Just know that if you go out and you listen to the advice that I'm going to give in this and some of the upcoming videos I have planned for the SAT, know that those scores are very, very attainable as long as you're willing to put in the work on your end, and you're going to have that internal belief in yourself that you absolutely can get to those scores, no matter where you might find yourself academically in school or what other people think of you. The very first step you have to take is go and do an online practice test in order to see where you're at on the SAT prep. You remember when I said that you need to be able to believe in yourself? I'm gonna keep it very real with you. When I took that first practice test, I scored a 1280. Now, that's not an unreasonably high or low score, and this was with no prep at all. But with that 1280 score, I vividly remember my parents seeing that score and being like, oh yeah, there's pretty much no way you're gonna be able to get your score up to the 1550, which is why I scored on my first try on the SAT. They were like, no, there's absolutely no chance that that's possible. They didn't even believe in me, and I remember how much that kind of weighed me down as I was doing my prep. Because they didn't believe in me, I didn't really believe in myself. And so if you're in an environment where maybe you might not have people believing in you in your school or your home or whatever, just know that you're not alone. A lot of us do go through that, and I believe in you. You can absolutely get in the 1550 if you want to put in the work. Now, let's keep going from here, right? The first step that you need to do is take that practice test. It does not matter what score you get. Anyone is capable of scoring the top scores on a standardized test. But how do we do that, Pratik? Well, the goal of this video is to dive into the first step of doing that, which is mastering the math section of the SAT. This is where the majority of your free points will come. The math section is easy. It doesn't matter if you struggle with math, you have to understand that the math section is easy. And so in order to excel in this section, you need to have the goal mindset that you're going to be able to get an 800 in the math section. A perfect score in the math section is absolutely vital to performing well on the SAT, because when you think about the scope of a 1600, missing 3 points in the math section is just completely unreasonable. You cannot be doing that. And so I'm going to break this video up into different segments depending on where your initial test score is at. I've set up chapter marks in the video so you can skip to whatever score band you feel is appropriate to you. But if you have the time, watch through the entire guide. That'll give you the most holistic advice that you need to succeed on your SAT. If you took your first SAT practice test and you scored less than a 600 on the math section, well, there's two ways we can look at this. Either one, you can just cry, or you can whine about how hard math is and how you'll never be able to get a perfect score. Or two, you can look at it as, hey, I scored a 510 on my first practice test. That means I can improve by 290 points in the math section, so that one day when I make a YouTube channel, I can have some crazy clickbait thumbnail. I prefer the second option because regardless of where you stand, it just means you're gonna have to put in a couple more hours, but it's nothing unreasonable towards getting an 800. So if you are stuck in that first band, right, that somewhere between 200 is the minimum points you can get and 600, what you're realizing now from this first practice test you've taken is that there are fundamental concepts that you don't know. Somewhere on this test, when you go through and you review the problems, there are bound to be situations that come up here, different problems that arose where you didn't know how to effectively solve them. Because when you score less than a 600, it's not just careless mistakes that you're making, right? It's some deep concepts, whether it's trig, whether it's something related to quadratics that you truly don't know. So in order to increase your score, what you're better off doing is not just simply doing bulk practice tests, but rather to go through, grab yourself an SAT preparation textbook. Any of them will be fine. The majority of them do a great job of the math section in particular, and you're just going to go through and learn all the concepts that you don't know. And in those sections, you're going to find and identify the concepts by looking at your old practice tests, seeing what went wrong, and then you're going to study them. So one of the things for me that was a little tricky when I first got into SAT was I wasn't super familiar with my trig stuff. It wasn't covered as heavily in my school, and so I identified trig as like a problem area that I needed to work on. So what did I do, right? I went and I think I grabbed the Princeton Review textbook and I used some online resources. The Khan Academy stuff is great for math as well. And I just went through and I learned all the basics to trig, right? You learn all your SOHCAHTOA, all that other good stuff that comes along with it. And then I just did a bunch of practice problems. And that way, when I took my next practice test, I didn't get any of these trig problems wrong. You do that same thing for each of the concepts that you're struggling with at some point. I can't tell you whether it'll be in a few days, a few weeks, but you'll realize that there are no more concepts that you struggle with. It's a weird realization when you get to that stage and you realize that, oh shoot, I actually know all of this. But when you do, it'll be perfectly exemplified by your score, which will have equally gone up with this increased math knowledge. I get it. For some people, especially if you're in this band, math might be a little bit challenging. You might not have been given the aid in school or whatever. They don't go as deep into it, and really math is like a language, so if you're not constantly exposed to it, it absolutely just goes away. But just know that the SAT math barely touches like pre-calculus. It really just goes through the depths of algebra, and so none of this is beyond a level that's like too hard for anyone to do. If you just put in the time into the math section, the reward for the time that you put in is super great, because what you can do in the math section that's different than other sections is that within like a fixated amount of time, a short amount of time, you can dramatically increase your score through just learning basic concepts and then improving test taking techniques, which we'll talk about in some of these higher score band ranges. And so unlike the reading section, which takes, potentially weeks to months of developing strong reading comprehension, math is simply something that can be learned. Right? Everything about math is almost like, it's like binary in the sense that you're either right or you're wrong. There's not even room for like gray area and critical thinking here. You just need to learn the concepts. Once you start to get a foothold into the SAT math, that's when you'll enter the next subband, that 600 to 700 range. Now, this is personally where I started because I had some experience in math beforehand. Bro, I'm brown. Who am I kidding, right? Like, this is what we grew up on. So I'm assuming that like most of my audience is probably somewhere in this band if your goal is to be like a competitive student for this. So where do you begin? One of the things that I think caught me off guard when I first began working with the SAT was that I wasn't as familiar with the wordings and the ways that the questions were designed. I think that's something you're able to get better accustomed to as you continue doing practice tests, but just in general, get familiar with the types of problems that they do and the wordings of the problem so that you don't get tripped off of basic things as you're moving down the line. Now, if you use like different textbook-based materials, they're going to have questions that are worded differently. I know companies like the Princeton Review and Barron's can do like all the marketing that they want to convince you that their practice tests are just as good as the actual College Board ones, but the truth is they're not. And yet at the same time, you want to take those best College Board tests out there, the ones that Khan Academy provides that are actually like exactly like the SAT, and you want to try to like ration those and save those for prep right before your real exam. So what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to like have some balance between using like the online Khan Academy math resources as well as these other textbook resources to really get yourself familiar with the concepts, and use those other companies' textbooks as you're getting in like your bulk prep. But then later down the line, before your actual exam, you use the official, College Board math prep, and that'll get you in like the ideal, perfect mind frame to go out there and excel on the test. This is the score band where you want to start cracking down on the smaller problems. You likely don't have a problem with factoring or basic algebra if you're scoring over, a 600 or even approaching a 700, but really it's like the little concepts. So for me, I know one thing that really annoyed me were like the little probability problems. They would just like, the first couple times I did them, they just confused me. Like I wasn't really sure what to do. And so that was a particular area where that probability question might come up once or twice on the entire test. So it's not like a big red flag, but it's consistently missing, 20, 30 points off of those types of questions. That does hold your score back. So focusing in on that area, fixing that problem over time, just gradually increase that score. And when you do that multiple times, you can see where I'm going with this. You want to keep up doing practice tests consistently as you're improving your scores. I remember the very first practice test I did, I scored that 1280, I believe, and the exact breakdown was a 660 in reading writing with a 620 in math. I scored a lot lower in math. I know, like, statistically, I made a lot more mistakes in the other section, but the College Board people are a little bit more brutal when they do those, like, math, like, score reductions. And so what I did was, after I did a bunch of math prep, I came back and did my next practice test a couple months later, and that's when I started doing practice tests consistently, and I scored about a 700 in the math section, I believe. So there was a pretty substantial score increase just from learning all those basic concepts and keeping up the practice on my end. Now, you want to keep up doing those practice tests, but more importantly, when you do these practice tests, they're not simply just for the actual practice. You also want to be able to learn from these mistakes. And so one of the things that I did, at least to some extent, was I had something called a mistake journal. So what I did was I'd had my practice test printed out, and for questions that I got wrong, and it was like a concept that I didn't fully understand, I'd learn the concept, and then I'd take the problem, I'd cut it out, and I'd put it in a mistake journal that I had for the math section. I'd tape in the piece of paper, and then I'd write down like what the mistake that I made was, and then what I did to correct it, and what I'm like going to do moving forward. And that way, for like the kind of the trickiest of problems, they're all in there. And then later on, you can review that before you take your exam. And it also it just helps the information sit in better when you take that extra step. A combination of meticulously reviewing all your mistakes to see where you went wrong and how you can learn from it, and then making like better notes for the actual most challenging problems is really going to push your score into the next band that we're now going to talk about, which is between getting a 700 and a 780. Right off the bat, if you're over a 700, I'm telling you right now, the jump to getting to an 800 is this close. Like getting a 700 means that you only got like a very few number of questions wrong, and that you're almost there. We just need to do a couple more things to refine what you're doing. So here's exactly what you're going to do if you're in this band, because I know so many people get up to the 700 band and then they just kind of fumble the bag on the real exam. What you're going to do is you're going to go find this Dr. John Chung's textbook. I put this in a YouTube short. I don't know how many people listen to me, but I'm going to say it one more time, bro. Get this book. Oh my goodness, like the problems here are way harder than the exam, but that's exactly why it's so good. You're gonna get this book of practice tests, you're gonna do as many of these as you can. There's this YouTube channel out there, I think it's called Scalar Learning, where the guy from that channel like goes through and he answers like in detail all the questions from all the practice tests. So after you do your practice test, you go onto YouTube and you find that Scalar Learning guy, you look up the exact Dr. John Chung's textbook that like you used, and he'll have like a live stream where he goes through and answers all the questions. So that way, if you've made mistakes, you can learn from him, and like some of these problems are much more tricky. So when you learn that concept and you get like a difficult trig problem here and an easy one on the SAT, it's become so free to just do it. So you're going to do these practice tests and you're just going to watch your score increase over time. Now, this is the section where we bring in a new concept we haven't talked about. Everything up until this point has been that in order to improve your score, you need to get better at math. But the SAT is fundamentally a standardized test, and test-taking techniques are at really the forefront of every top scorer. Nobody gets a 1600 on the SAT by being a bad bad test taker and just knowing all the knowledge. And this test taking technique advice is something that I ended up using like into all of my schoolwork and even now and today. Like between my SAT stuff, I took a subject test, which you guys don't have to worry about, but then my IB exams and all of that, I've become like a really, really good test taker. And so even like in college now, if I'm not the most intelligent, brilliant, genius student in the classroom, I'm still able to score up there among those students because I'm good at the test taking that I do, which was learned from the SAT. So your first lesson in test taking is going to come right now. You need to learn how to get your pacing down to a perfection. Now, what you have to understand about the SAT is that it is a slower paced test. The SAT values the perfection and the accuracy over the amount of time that you're spending on it. So for the average candidate that comes into this range, and for with most people who take the SAT, you're going to take let's say the no calculator section, because this is the easier one. You're going to finish it and you're going to realize that you have several minutes left over. Some people even finish it with half the time remaining. Here's what I'm going to tell you now. You have to learn to slow down. I don't care how easy the problem is, you have that remaining time and it does nothing for you to just keep it there and save it. I want you to slow down when you're reading the questions. I want you to slow down as you're answering the questions. It might feel a little awkward at first. You might even make more careless mistakes because of it. But as you learn to really keep yourself present and conscious every time you're taking your test, you're answering, you're really focusing on the problems, you'll find you're able to reduce the number of careless errors that you make. And then as you go through it, you have, say, a couple minutes left over. You're not moving at snail pace here, but you're not trying to rush through it. You take the minutes that are left over and you restart the test and you just keep going. Either if you have starter problems, questions that you're unsure about and you star them, you're going to come back to them. You're going to review those questions first, but you also take the remaining time and you can go through it and you can read through each of the problems again and just make sure that you did it correctly. You can check your answer sheet. You can check to make sure that all your answers line up. That's what you're going to want to do with the extra time. Make sure you don't waste any of the time. If it's a 25-minute section, you are working for all 25 minutes of it. Do not be that person that finishes their SAT math section in 5 minutes and then just chills this during the exam to try to be cool, and then they get their score back and they get a 740 in the math section because they made 6 careless errors. That is the worst possible thing you can do. Make sure you use all your time. Here's a tip people don't talk about. Abuse your calculator. I used a TI-84 plus CE for my exam. I want you to know the ins and outs of your graphing calculator. You should not be pulling up, first of all, you should not be pulling up to an SAT with a scientific calculator. Okay, that's a mistake. There are problems on the SAT that you can just streamline using your graphing calculator. If it's a question where you need to be finding roots and stuff, you can literally just plug it into your graphing calculator and then put in another line, find the intersect points and do it. Even if it takes exactly as much time to plug in the numbers into your calculator as it does to do one of those quadratic formula questions by hand, you have to understand that if you do it with your calculator, you cannot be wrong. You're always right if you use the calculator, and you're not really people make it a big deal of pushing in numbers into your calculator wrong and stuff. That's not really a common mistake that I find that really happens once you get comfortable and good at using your calculator. So you need to know the ins and outs of that. Another thing that I did, this was more for my SAT math subject test that I had to do, was to download calculator programs. I didn't use this as much for my SAT, but it might be beneficial to some people. And so what you can do is, if you're not familiar, you can actually download programs onto your SAT calculator. It's perfectly legal for the SAT. And what you can do is, if there's certain math topics, if it's something related to sequences and series, or something related to trig is something that could be common, you can download hack apps onto your calculator that'll solve it for you. So you could download, for example, for trig, a triangle solver, where you can, instead of using law of sines and law of cosines, you can just put in the values that you do have into the triangle solver, and it'll literally tell you every angle and side length of the triangle. That could be useful for your SAT, right? Now, don't download calculator programs for basic stuff, okay? If it's the most easy factoring problem ever, you should not need a calculator to do that, okay? You should have the knowledge. That's why I don't support using certain types of basic solvers as apps. You should just know how to do those. But for other more complicated things, that's a potential route you could take. The final section of this video that we need to discuss is what happens when you get to that perfect score or near perfect score level. Here is my the golden tip of this video, okay? When you're doing the SAT math section, you need to take your pencil and underline exactly what they are asking for every single question. So many times in the SAT, there will be a problem where they ask you to solve for X, and after that, they'll say, give your answer in terms of like 2x plus 7. So if x was 5, you would need to do 2x plus 7, which would be 17. And so the answer that you'll need to select is 17. But x was 5, right? So one of the answers in the ABCD will be 5. It's not nice that they do that to you, but that's just a matter of fact. That's what they do on the SAT. You should never get those questions wrong, but yet they're a place of so many common pitfalls and a way to take your 800 SAT score and on a tricky curve, have that dropped to a 770 because you made one careless mistake. That 30-point difference could be the difference between a 1520 and a 1490, which is this 30 points, but it's a lot when you really think about it at that top score level. So underlining every question, what they're asking, is going to keep you focused and present. It's going to make sure that technique in itself cut my careless mistakes down so much. Growing up in high school and stuff, I was always the type of kid to get like 1 or 2 careless mistakes on pretty much like every single math test that I took. It was pretty much inevitable no matter how well I knew the concepts. And when I took my SAT, I found I was the exact same way. But by pacing myself better, doing the underlying techniques, I was really able to minimize that gap. In your exams leading up to the SAT, in particular, I mean like the College Board exams, you should be getting perfect 800s consistently on these exams. I got perfect 800 consistently. The thing that I find a lot of these like near top scorers, people who get in like between 1500 and like 1530 range, what I find happens to people in this band is that on their practice test before their SAT, they consistently score like a 770 or 780 or 790 on their SAT math sections. They usually get between like 1 and 3 questions wrong within, out of the 50 plus questions, which is great, but they consistently get it. And yet in their mind, they expect that when they go off and take the SAT, they're going to just get the 800. And then when they go and take the SAT and they get a 780, exactly like what they were getting on the practice tests, they're so confused and they just get mad about it. They're like, oh man, I made a careless mistake because they had some tricky cylinder problem and I didn't know the formula for it. But the way I see it, it's like bro, you weren't ever able to prove that you were at that 800 level consistently. So how can you expect yourself to do better on the exam, like miraculously? That's just not going to happen. And so what I want you guys to know going into the exam is that you need to be at that level where you're getting those 800 consistently. And if you're not, well then that's where you need to be able to do that critical thinking and reflection and understand where your problems are going wrong. Are you making careless mistakes? Are you actually missing like formulas every once in a while? Are there certain like weirdly connected types of problems that just tend to trip you up? Is it something related to like a statistical concept, or is it like if the question is really long, you just have a hard time deciphering what they mean? Being like very critical, open-minded, and constantly trying to bring in like new perspectives and stimulus into the way that you approach your studying, that's what's going to get you to that top level so that you are scoring consistently. I think out of the 6 practice tests I did leading up to my SAT, like the last 6, I think I got perfect 800s in the math section on 5 of them. And the exact score that I got on my very last practice test, which was a 1550, was exactly what I scored on the SAT. I got a 1550. The practice tests from College Board are very indicative of your scores. So if you're near that 800 mark, just make sure you push through, you keep yourself calm, nice and relaxed, right? Don't think about the 800 and needing to get a perfect score. Just think about this particular problem that you're working on. How can I make sure that I don't make a mistake on this problem? How can I make sure I do it correctly? And then at the end of it, right, use your time effectively in order to check all your answers and you'll be good to go. I trust that each and every one of you, if you apply these steps, you put in the time, right? You give yourself a couple weeks to months, you pick out a test date, and you plan it all back accordingly, you definitely can get an 800. It's not that hard. That's it for this video. I got you guys with reading and writing guides in the future. If you have any SAT questions, let me know and I'll make a little YouTube short on it. Thank you so much for watching. This has been your boy Pratik. Peace out.